Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, we'll just go with this then. Yeah, first of all, congrats on getting the interview invite. Do you know your dates yet?
Thanks. No idea. They haven't told me yet.
Okay, so still waiting. Today I thought the best thing to do would be is I'm going to run an economics interview for you. I'll just focus on that today. So I'm going to run it like a just formal interview. So I'm not going to give you any feedback whilst we go over the questions. So I'll give you feedback at the end. Okay. So just to give you a little structure on how this is split up, it's going to be personal statement based questions first, then we'll run through a couple of problem solving questions, and then a bit of general, just some interesting economics questions. So if you're ready, we'll just get straight in.
I just need to pull up my personal statement on screen, if that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. I think obviously in an interview, just make sure you've run through it.
Yeah, I have it on paper.
Yeah, cool.
All right. Yep.
Ready? Okay. So we'll just start with a general question first. If you could just tell me what kind of started your interest in economics? What led you to want to study economics?
So I think for me, the main reason for my interest in economics was that I play football, and in my football team at least, there's people from very different backgrounds. And I think I must have been like 12 or 13, maybe a bit younger. And we had to buy new footballs for the team, and everyone had to contribute like 40 euros to that. And for my family, fortunately enough, that wasn't an issue. But I came to realize through conversations with other children in my squad that for some people these 40 euros were an issue. And I found that to be very interesting. And it kind of radically changed the way I view the way I viewed like just that value, those 40 euros. And then from that, I started talking first to my parents about this, and then eventually doing some research on my own. And that's kind of how it all started, those 40 euros, basically.
It sounds like that really kind of gave you an introduction into the value of money, really. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Okay, that's interesting. So I've looked at your personal statement and I've seen that you've written ideas, and one of the things that you talk about is how businesses in general, they don't really have an incentive to act ethically. So in your opinion, you're basically saying they care about, I'm supposing profits or other incentives. So can you tell me about when this might not be the case, when businesses might actually be incentivized to make ethical decisions in order to see long-term success?
Yeah, so I think immediately I see two main possibilities. One would be if there are incentives, possibly monetary incentives to do so. Another situation would be if there are almost societal incentives. So, for example, let's start with the first. If a state heavily subsidizes, for example, companies which are good for climate change, so for example, which have very green supply chains, I think that's definitely an incentive for the company to act in a way that it benefits climate change. No, that doesn't benefit climate change. That goes against that benefits the planet that way. And then again, if, for example, we look at societal pressure, companies now through social media and through just the way everything's become more public in the last years, are under a lot more scrutiny by the general public. And of course, having a favorable public opinion is in general quite good, right? Because you still want people to buy your goods, and if you're a company, maybe less people would buy your goods if they consider you to be heavily unethical. And so I think I see those main reasons, like state power and the power of the people.
Great. Do you have any examples for that second point? So that sort of changing kind of consumer preference really to lean towards companies that do value, incentives beyond just profit.
Sure. Yes, I think. Do you mean an example where consumers actively shifted, or an example where companies adapted to market to consumers?
Be happy with either one, but the first one sounds a bit more interesting. Which industries maybe particularly have seen that shift in how consumers consider what and when to buy?
I think I would definitely see industries that have like supply chains that have like very sort of opaque supply chains. So one that comes to mind for me immediately is the textile industry, where in recent years we've seen a lot of resurgence in secondhand clothing shopping and in renewable brands in sort of trying to put a lot of weight on that. And fast fashion has kind of declined to the point where brands which are typically known for fast fashion um, are are now having to adapt to that. And I think the best example of such a brand would be Shein, which several years ago was still very popular, and nowadays is sort of like almost if you even say their name, you will get very judged a lot by other people. So I think those societal pressures are definitely seen there.
Great. So let's stay on the topic of that kind of labor exploitation, climate change stuff that you mentioned later on as well. So,
Mhm.
with these particular issues, you mentioned that the state sort of they have to intervene, they should intervene. Can you
Yeah.
think of a case or a way that the free market might be able to solve these particular issues? You can, let's say, climate change. Is there a way that we can find free market solutions to this, and what might that be?
Um, So when you mean free market, do you mean like a perfectly free market, or do you mean a free market in the sense as we have it now? So like a free market with still some limitations.
I mean, so what are the, let's start with typically the state deals with issues of climate change. What kind of policies have they implemented to kind of try and mitigate the effects of climate change?
I mean, I think the most obvious would be like environmental and sustainable governance, and for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of states have really pushed those onto their companies and have heavily incentivized it through subsidies. I think that's like the main way that countries try to direct to use their policy to direct the businesses in their region.
So without government intervention, is there any way to mitigate any effects of climate change? Is there any way to incentivize businesses or consumers to act differently?
Hmm. Well, I guess there is through the public perception aspect I mentioned earlier, right? Where if you're a company, you have an incentive to appeal to your customers, and if customers have a very sharp perception of ethical issues, then it wouldn't be desirable for you to be unethical because you wouldn't appeal to them. And so, therefore, in this case, I guess it would be a free market mechanism that is that is applying there.
Great. So moving on a little bit, you also spend a little bit of time talking about the Eurozone debt and things like that. So my first question to you would just be, is there ever a case where we should forgive a country's debt?
Well, I think maybe it's interesting to think about this more in principle, whereas because finding a specific example may prove quite difficult. But let's say we don't forgive a specific country's debt. I think sovereign debt has like the tendency of with compound interest lasting until very, very long. And so, for example, if we weren't to forgive a country's debt, that might actually lead the country to spiral into such a depression that it would, in the long term, not even be beneficial for us because we wouldn't get our debt even repaid. And so, in that sense, maybe forgiving the debts and restructuring it have to have other sovereign debt at a later point when the economy has recovered may be a more sensible solution.
And can you see a sort of what's a major reason why we shouldn't forgive that debt?
Well, if we forgive one debt, then it starts to become like it could become like a sort of status quo, and we definitely don't want that. I mean, that should still that should still definitely have the underlying assumption that you need to repay it, and vice versa. There should still be the risk that it won't be repaid. Otherwise, the mechanisms don't make sense, obviously.
Uh, okay, so then in terms of when the banks failed, obviously at that point there was a big government bailout. Is that basically the same thing, would you say, or why choose to do that in that case?
So those are two different questions, I think. First of all, whether it's exactly the same thing. I think it's hard to equate a country with a bank, right? A bank is an institution, almost a company, basically, primarily centered on profits. And the banks which were bailed out also were bailed out because of their position in the economy, right? They weren't just bailed out just for fun, basically. It's because had these banks not been bailed out, the entire economy would have suffered. And I think in the case of some countries, they may also be in that too big to fail position, but some countries won't be. And I think there we see a clear difference. And as for the second part of the question, could you repeat that again?
You know what? I think that's a fine answer, actually. So we'll just move on from
Okay.
that. So kind of sticking to that area where you've discussed ideas to do with, I believe, yeah. So you were talking about the Eurozone. So can you tell me some of the weaknesses of a currency union?
Yeah. Well, the weaknesses of a currency union are obviously that once you are in that currency union, you have to the countries which are in that currency union need to be very similar, for example, in their business cycles, because I think it's very clear to see why, right? If in one country suddenly inflation goes up, then we want to be able to have the monetary policy to control that inflation. But if simultaneously in another country, or I guess we could say regions of this currency zone, the situation is dire and we would need, for example, to lower interest rates, then suddenly we have a conflict there. Which are we going to prioritize? So I think a weakness of a currency zone would be if there is this sort of asymmetry in the business cycles, then that's going to be very problematic for the currency zone. And another main weakness, I would say, which we also saw in the Eurozone crisis, is if these countries, if the union doesn't correspond with a sense of like almost national, or let's say not organizational. I think if the regions view themselves primarily as the regions and not the entity as a whole. So, for example, if let's say the economy of Texas has a bit of a depression and the economy of California is currently doing well, most Americans won't care at all that the economy of California is like almost bailing out the economy, or is taking up a bit of inflationary strain for the economy of Texas. But in this case of the Eurozone crisis, Germany cared a lot about not suffering from inflation in order to almost like bail out Greece. And so I see those two as being like the main weaknesses.
That's really interesting. Great. I'd like to move on to some problem solving.
Yeah.
So I am going to try and share my screen here. So if you can take a look at that graph for me there. So have you understood what an indifference curve is? Could you just make sure that we're okay with that?
So I think if I understand that correctly, an indifference curve would be that sort of like it shows sets of two goods, where the sort of like the happiness gained, or the, I guess, utility would be a better word, the utility gained from having, let's say, one piece of X and three pieces of Y is the same as on every other point and on every other combination on that curve. And I guess one curve stands for like one amount of utility, and then for other amounts of utility, you would need other curves to describe them more accurately.
Okay, so can you take that knowledge and then interpret for me this graph that shows chocolate against pizza? So for this particular consumer, how do they feel about these two goods?
Right. Yes. So I think right away it's useful if we sort of mentally label this graph. So let's say, for example, at the very left of the graph, we have a high amount of chocolate and a low amount of pizza. And so if we ascribe just, let's say, the values 1 and 6 to them, then we see that we have this specific bundle sort of like one pizza and one chocolate. And that seems to be very similar to the utility that is being felt, or the happiness that's being felt from having the same amount of pizza to the same amount of chocolate. Now, there appears to be a bit of a larger gap between the x-axis and the graph on the pizza. Is that just an error of the graph, or should I take that into account?
Yeah, good question. I think just assume that is actually even. So on
Okay.
both sides.
Right. So right away, I think what we can see is that it's not a one-to-one correlation, right? It's not like 1 and 1 and then 2 and 2 and then 3, or rather 1 and 6 and then 5 and 2 and so on, because otherwise it would be a linear graph, right? So I think there has to be like one point where, for example, let's say three sets of pizza and 2 sets of chocolate gives the user the same utility, but then it doesn't directly go to 4 and 1, but maybe it's more like, I guess this works better with higher numbers, but it's that there is like a change sort of in the I'm not sure if slope would be the right term for it, but that there is a change in the situation.
Okay.
In the relationship, I think.
So there is some sort of relationship here. We want both some of pizza and some of chocolate at all times. We're fairly indifferent between the two, so we don't really care if it's 8 pizzas, 2 chocolate bars, or 8 chocolate bars, 2 pizzas. That would be exactly the same thing for us. So we don't really care about the exact quantities of either, as long as we kind of have a total that is the same. So in the second part here, it says, PS5s and Xboxes. How would we expect the indifference curves for this set of goods to look like?
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So I think I'd start by looking at what characterizes a PS5 and an Xbox, right? Like what makes a PS5 and an Xbox different from chocolate and pizza? And I think the main thing is that an Xbox and a PS5 are basically the same thing, essentially, unless we assume that, for example, a PS5 has like exclusive games that an Xbox doesn't have. So should we assume that, or should we just say that they're basically the same thing?
You can call them basically substitutes. Yeah, that
Okay,
sounds good.
good. Then in this case, I think what we would expect to see is that, so since they're substitutes, as you
Let's
called
call
them.
them substitutes.
Okay, so we should call them, how should we call them? Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Let's assume that they're perfect substitutes. So a
Okay,
consumer can
perfect
tell
substitute.
between one or the other.
Well, then I guess if they are basically the same thing, then what we would expect to see is that having 3 Xboxes and 2 PS5s would bring the same happiness as two Xboxes and 3 PS5s, and so on for every combination. So I think the graph would be linear,
Okay.
like going down in a linear shape.
Yeah, excellent, good. So we don't care whatsoever if we have none of one, as long as we have the other, because they are perfect substitutes. Can you do the same thing for me with left shoe, right shoe?
Okay, so again, thinking about the properties of a left shoe and a right shoe, what stands out is that you really only need 2. Like the rest are basically don't bring about much more like utility in that sense, because you can only wear 2. And so I think like if you have 1 left shoe and 1 right shoe, or if you have 1 left shoe and 2 right shoes, or 1 left shoe and 3 right shoes, 1 left shoe and 4 right shoes, would basically be the same utility, I think, and vice versa. And so I need to sketch it out real quick. I think if we have 1 and 1, and then it's the same utility going up and going right, I think it would sort of look like an L curve of sorts, like this.
Yeah, that's correct. But could you just clarify for me? So so the relationship is, you're saying you don't need anything past a left shoe and a right shoe. So do you think a consumer will differentiate between that bundle and 2 left shoes, 1 right shoe?
I think that's like what I meant in the sense that they won't really differentiate between that. So like 1 left shoe and right shoe is the same to them as 1 and 5,
Good.
either way.
Yep. Okay, good. Yeah, just wanted to clarify that. But the shape is absolutely right. Okay, can you scroll back a bit, please, and have a look at question 4? Should be on the screen shared page actually as well for you, if you can look there.
Oh yeah, I've seen it.
Okay, great. So we're looking at a question here. We've got a stretch of beach. So I want to ask you, if there are 2 sellers, let's start with that, right? So 2 sellers on the beach, how would you expect them to set up?
Okay, so I think I'm just going to draw out a beach. I think for two sellers, it would. Can I assume that like there are no real differences about the sellers, so that like they sell the same thing at the same price?
Exactly. Yep. Everything is
Okay.
identical prices,
Okay.
identical features, identical products, no difference whatsoever.
So then the only real difference is location, I guess. And so then we would expect each of them to want to have like 50% of the location. So right away, they will want to be exactly like at opposite points or exactly at 2/3 each. And I think let's just assume that as a beginning they are at 2/3 or at the far left or far right. I think what might happen is that one of them will like move towards the center to get more of the share, which obviously the other person will want. And preemptively, in order to like prevent that, they would both shift towards the middle, and so they would stop at like basically being right next to each other, or at least relatively next to each other. No, I would say right next to each other, actually.
Great. So then let's introduce a third seller into the mix. Do you know what a Nash equilibrium is?
I think I've heard of it, yeah.
Can you give me a quick definition of what that is?
I think it's a situation in which none of the players in a game have a real incentive to switch their strategy.
That sounds good. So let's introduce that third seller. Where would he go? Is there a Nash in this case?
So am I assuming that the two are already set up next to each other?
They are, yes.
Okay. So we have the two set up right next to each other, and the third player comes in. So I think it might be useful to look at like what share of the beach he could get by positioning himself on different places and how the other two vendors would react to that. So if let's say he decides to position himself just underneath the two of them, then the share of the beach he's going to get realistically is going to be like sort of a almost a half circle like underneath them.
Can I just for 1 second? So I want them to be able to locate along a line. I should have
Oh, okay,
clarified that.
it's a line. Okay. Huh. Then we certainly know that he doesn't that the vendor um doesn't want to be like in the middle of them, because then he would get 0% of the share. So it's either going to be to the right or to the left before the other two move. And so I think it would actually, in this case, make no difference whether they move to the right or to the left, except I think they would position themselves as close to the left or the right one as they could, because then they would basically get the entire portion of the line. And the other person would become the one in the middle and so get nothing.
Great. And then what will happen after that? So is there a Nash equilibrium in this case?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. So, and then the other vendor would probably attempt to do the same either to the vendor on the other side or to the vendor who has positioned himself there. So if we imagine a line and they are now positioned like with two on either side of the middle and then another one here, then this vendor is of course going to get more of the share if he goes in front of the other vendor on the other side, right? Because if we assume that like they all have equal sizes, the vendors, then the share on that side, if we take like x minus the shape of one house versus x minus the shape of two houses, he would get more of the share by going there. So he's going to go on the other side. And then, however, the one who is now being beaten is going to go on the other side, and so on and so forth, until there are two on one side and one on the other side, I guess.
Great. So so outcome being there's just not going to be a situation where any of them will be settled at one point, right?
Yeah, I guess. I don't think there would be an equilibrium because even if one of them then decides to move to the middle again, they would get twice as much of the share as any of the others, and so things would shift again. So I don't see an equilibrium forming there.
Great. So, this is a famous theory by Hotelling. He wrote a paper back in the 1920s. So, where can we see this idea sort of applied in real life? Where do you see this style where businesses tend to locate by each other?
Do you mean in a very physical sense or more in an abstract sense where maybe we take the line to be like a spectrum of types of
Very
goods?
interesting. Either one is fine. Actually, let's go with the second one.
Then I would say what we tend to see, for example, let's say in the film industry, is that typically blockbuster films are very similar to each other, right? And so if we take, like, for example, The Line to be the degree of creativity or tropiness of a film, then I guess having, for example, Marvel and DC make exactly the same movies, that would be an example of both of them positioning themselves along the middle, which would be like very safe, I guess.
That's great. Okay, just a couple of economics questions from recent events to finish, and then right. So, are you familiar with the companies Vodafone and Three UK?
Uh, yes, I've heard of them both, definitely.
So you know what they do?
I think they provide like services for like to for like callings, not calling services, but like mobile data services. Is that the
Great.
term? I'm not sure.
Yeah, good. So both telecoms companies. Now
Yeah,
they are
telecoms. Exactly.
doing a merger. Um,
Mhm.
what do you think about this? Should this be allowed?
Okay, well, I guess the danger of a merger is that I guess there's two dangers. There's dangers for the on the smaller level, like employees of the companies being necessarily cut in most mergers, or like things like that happening, restructurings within the companies. And then there's also dangers on a greater level of the whole economy, basically. And I think if we take, I'm not quite aware of the market share that Three and Vodafone have, but I'm assuming based on how famous they both are that it's quite significant. And a merger could therefore lead to them forming a sort of monopoly with their new position, or at least becoming very powerful within the market, which I think is dangerous for several reasons. Because with this large share of the market, they basically control a large part of the market, which is not very good for the consumer. I think because there's less
Okay.
competition, basically.
I just want to rewind a little bit. So you did say that you think it's important to know what type of market share these two companies have, and you've equated fame to it meaning that they must have large market share. When we kind of define different market structures, do you think that matters at all, the branding of it? Is that enough to determine what type of market it is? What other factors could we look at instead?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question.
So tell me about what types of market structures do you know?
So do you mean like free markets where there's like competitions, and then markets where maybe one or two companies dominate, like those types of structures?
Okay, so one or two companies dominating, yes, that is what I'm talking about. Free market is not quite the other end. One or two market companies is still free market. So it would be on
Okay.
the one end of a highly contestable markets where you have many, many companies sharing the market, and then on the other side
Hmm.
you'd have more monopoly, duopoly, oligopoly, who would maybe be
Okay.
one or a few firms. So let's take the example of Vodafone and Three UK. Which one of these markets do you think it is likely to be operating in, and why?
I would say based on the type of business that telecoms is, because it requires like such a large infrastructure, I think we would expect it to be I said oligopoly, right? Which mean many companies, but still not a lot, right? So I think it would be that where maybe there's like five or six big companies who are big enough to have the infrastructure, but not like tons of them, as in the other end of the markets of the spectrum you mentioned.
Okay, and I think that is all I really wanted to ask you on that particular point. I've got a pretty good idea of your skills and what you could work on and what you do well. So do you have any questions, first of all, before I get into the feedback?
Like specifically about this or?
Yeah, you can ask me as we go along, and then I'm sure we'll
Okay,
have.
right. All right.
Okay, first of all, Pueblo, I have to say, I think that was like overall extremely good, to be honest.
Okay.
I think that you're really, really on the right track here. Um, you don't have a lot of weaknesses, to be honest. Let's go over what you do well, first of all. In terms of the problems that you walked through, there's honestly not much you should change about that at all. You walked through it really well. Just make sure you're kind of when it comes to which we looked at. Oh yeah, in different styles and things. It was getting a tiny bit confusing when you were explaining, for example,
Mm-hmm.
relationship between left shoe, right shoe. So I just did want
Okay.
to clarify that point because although you got the right, the wording of it wasn't exactly what your result ended up as. So obviously, as a tutor, you might think, okay, have you understood it, or do you just know this?
Yeah.
So just make sure you're kind of just rushing through that answer. If you don't know, it's absolutely fine to be like, am I on the right track? Can you just, just make sure? But there was that. But apart from that, overall, the problem solving set part was excellent. Hotelling's question, the example you gave was really, really good, and it's super high level, to be honest, to be able to extend it beyond just physical location onto a minimum differentiation in the sense of characteristics. So that was excellent. Just to give you a couple more examples you might want to look at. So with hotellings, one of the most famous examples is to do with cereal. So the minimum differentiation between
Okay.
different types of cereal. The other thing is,
I'd heard of like McDonald's and Burger King as a famous example, and I didn't want to use that because
yeah,
that would have been too simple. So I tried to find something a bit more abstract.
yours
And
was
actually, I just came up with it on the spot, so
it was
I'm quite
excellent,
happy
honestly.
with it.
It's really good, yeah, really well done. The other thing that hotellings has some kind of interesting outcomes for is politics. So it's this idea of
Yeah,
never.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
So that could also be for you an interesting thing to bring up. So, I mean, knowledge is like key here. You knowing this has really had a good impact overall. When it comes to the starter question with kind of your first growing interest in economics, I'm just going to be totally
Hmm.
honest. It's across authentic, but the overall messaging is really confusing. It's
Okay.
not strong. I don't think it's very strong, to be honest. If you
Okay.
could
All right.
just you figuring out, some kids have less money is not, it's I'm just gonna be straightforward.
I mean, that was like legitimately the reason why I started carrying, but maybe I need to find something that's less true and more strong, like
I
in
think
that sense.
so. I would suggest a white lie there in what actual moment.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a bit of it is strategy that you need to use here, and it's just I think it's not the strongest start. Just because
So what would you suggest for a better start?
it could, if you can't think of anything particularly personal, it really can just be as simple as a book, just
Uh-huh.
saying I read this particular thing. Or for you, I mean, you do have quite a lot of research around the Eurozone and things like this, right? The crisis. So you could say like during
Mhm.
this crisis, well, maybe you were too young then actually.
Yeah, I was like 6 during the crisis, so they're not gonna
Yeah,
believe that.
at that point, let's do a bit more research. So maybe you could have been studying that in history or something, right? It came up, it's like that,
Hmm.
significantly personal, but it's not so much like, I mean, with the football example, it's just a bit confusing to be honest.
Yeah.
Okay, with the when it came to answering kind of like off the fly questions, to do with like when I was asking you about and you came up what was it? I think it was to do with like consumer, yeah, ethical decision making with companies. The reason I asked you about that in particular is because you, in your personal statement, make it sound like ethics doesn't matter at all, but there is a massively
Yeah.
growing industry. I would look into CSR, maybe flip through a book on it.
CSR.
CSR, it's corporate social responsibility, and
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
yeah. So just look into that a little bit because I think just some of the wording, especially because it's repeated throughout when you're very clear on your kind of opinions about it being businesses are driven by profit and climate change
Hmm.
has to be fixed by government and things like this. It comes across
Yeah,
very
I wouldn't
yeah
have written that way. Again, it's kind of confusing, but I
yeah it's
guess it's
yeah
also I guess it's also good because if they ask me about that, I can be prepared, and I guess they're more likely to ask me about that than about a perfect paragraph. So yeah.
No, 100%. And I think it's also, it actually shows real growth and development if you can say, you know what, I wrote that a few months ago, but since then I've done these readings and I've kind of changed my mind on it. They absolutely love that. They will, if you can kind of find that in somewhere, that they're going to be like, oh, okay, this kid is going to be the one I want to teach. Because they want to see that you've been, improving and reading and things like this, right? So yeah, just these ideas. I want you to look into a little bit more. If you mention climate change and things like this so often, I would expect you to have some idea of kind of, just how we actually tackle it on both a state level, an international whatever level, because this is an important topic, and just kind of saying governmental oversight, that's not really enough.
Yeah, of course.
What else was there? Yes. So I mean, a couple of basic things. I think you didn't study economics at school, right?
Nope.
Okay. Given that, I think your kind of reasoning and getting to the fact that oligopoly, that those telecoms companies are in an oligopoly market structure based on the fact that they have very high cost of infrastructure was excellent, because that is the reason, right? When you confused free market and monopoly, that's less good. Yeah. So
I just had no idea.
Yeah. So I think that kind of thing I would expect you to know, like, so free market mixed and then state driven command economy, right? These kind of basic definition stuff, I would want you to be a little bit more aware of. Things like monopoly and perfect competition. Again, they're not things that you have to know the names of, but it would be good for you to know it's many firms versus one firm, that level, and then what determines.
I wanted to say perfect competition, and I just said free market, which was kind of a slip up.
Yeah. I mean, if that is the case, then just correct yourself, when they say, it's like, oh, sorry, I did mean to say that, whatever, so that they just know. What did I write here? A bit confused. You need at least ILS. What does that mean? I can't read my own notes. Yeah, so I think overall, when it came to some of the middle questions, use a couple more examples. When you use your examples, like, for example, talking about Shein and like the textiles and consumer changing preferences, that was excellent. That was so strong. When you were talking about it in abstract, it was less convincing. So definitely brush up on some more examples. Just make sure you're kind of incorporating them into your answers. Honestly, apart from that, it was seriously pretty excellent, to be honest. I'd just look into the debt thing a tiny bit more if I were you. I mean, obviously, forgiving.
That's on the plan, definitely.
Yeah, good. And yeah, currency unions a tiny bit more as well. I didn't want to prod you too much on that because it felt a bit weaker. So it wouldn't. So that's the same with the tutors. If you have a really good thought on it, then they might want to lead that conversation and ask you questions about it more. If it seems like you just, you don't, there's no point them asking you about it because it's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for them, right? So just being a little bit more brushed up on those things, particularly what's in your personal statement, will just be, the best thing to do. But yeah, so I would say for you, you're doing really well right now in your prep, it seems like. But yeah, just cover those theories and things from your statement. Econ knowledge wise, I mean, because you haven't studied